So my mind also is quite blown by the last session. Thank you so much, Chris, for opening our minds to the possibilities that the questions we want to ask may not even be questions, if in fact they have any kind of bearing on truth. I'm going to bring things a slightly different way with this talk, hopefully still interesting, but something in a slightly different vein. So having heard so much about the kind of questions that we ask and think about, and perhaps what we ask about what is and what ought to be, we're going to think a little bit about the kind of questions that perhaps we ought to ask when thinking about these topics of fossils, evolution, and the Bible. Now, the reason that this talk is in here, that this topic comes up, is that as soon as you start talking about science and religion, or science and faith, particularly science and Christianity, one of the first questions that we find often comes up is people saying, well, what about creation? What about all this evolution stuff, you know, the Big Bang? How does the idea that God has something to do with creating the world fit with what we know about science and what science tells us about how the world is and how it has come to be? Those are the kind of questions that we're going to be exploring a little bit. Before we get into that, you were just informed, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. This isn't because I just like to hear about myself. This is because my introduction to myself, a little bit of my life story, I think gives some idea as to why I'm here talking about this kind of stuff. Now, the first thing that you need to know about me is that I'm a bit of a geek. I usually have to admit this straight away, particularly in schools, because I find that if I don't, people sit there through the entire session deciding for themselves, oh, you're a bit of a geek, aren't you? So if I admit it up front, things go far better for me. This is my proof of the fact. This is a photo of me when I was about 8 or 9 years old on holiday in France. And I spent that holiday, like I spent most of my childhood, and in fact much of my adulthood, getting quite wet and muddy, jumping in and out of lakes and rivers, streams, trees, caves, pretty much anywhere I could go to try and explore something about the world around me. So this is kind of where my love of science came from, was this fascination, this recognition that I loved finding out how stuff around me worked. This particular picture shows that off quite well. I've always been very interested in nature, in animal life especially, and in this picture I've got a praying mantis on my hand. Has anybody come across these? We've got any praying mantis experts in the room? I love these. They're incredible. They're insects, often fairly large, really well camouflaged, and their hunting strategies are quite impressive. So as an 8-year-old girl, you can imagine this. We'd go out and sort of hunt around in the bushes, and you see some things of interest, and you sort of hunker down in the bush and watch what's going to happen. And this praying mantis is there, quite well camouflaged, pretending to be a leaf, sort of swaying around in the breeze, looking for all the world like a harmless little stick, until some unsuspecting moth or butterfly comes past. Beautiful thing. At which point, the praying mantis leaps into action, grabs this thing out of midair, rips its head off, and sucks its guts out. And there's absolute carnage. It's brilliant. Okay, we're talking legs, wings, everywhere. Absolutely phenomenal, and just the kind of thing that every 8-year-old girl is into watching on her holidays. Perhaps not. I'm told it's a little strange, but I warned you I was a geek. Okay, so this is the kind of thing I've always loved, finding out about the world around me and how it works. I got a little bit older, and I figured out that was mostly called science. So I studied lots of science at school, at GCSE, A-level. I went to Cambridge University, did a degree called Natural Sciences, which allows you to combine lots of different types of the sort of standard disciplines of science into one kind of make-your-own degree. It's a wonderful thing to do. So I studied lots of evolutionary and behavioral biology, some geology, some history and philosophy of science, all kind of rolled in together, all to do with this idea of trying to find out more about the world around me and how it worked. I was particularly interested in questions of evolution, of what science could tell us about the different living things that had been around on Earth over time and how they were all related to each other, how we could discover more of that and figure it all out. So one of the areas of research that I was involved in, I know you'll all be fascinated by immediately, is the dental development of the Xenarthra. If you've never heard of the Xenarthra, don't worry about it, please. I also hadn't heard of them until I started working on them. It's a group of animals that includes things like sloths and armadillos and that kind of thing. And I was looking at the development of their teeth. Now, things like anteaters and armadillos are not really known for their teeth. Many of them don't have them as adults, but a lot of them still produce what we would call milk teeth or still have sort of the buds of teeth when they're developing in the womb. So I was looking at that development and trying to figure out what's happened with that, what the evolutionary processes over time have shaped them to not have teeth, thinking about why that might happen and how it fits with what we know about other animal life. But those kind of questions of how things have changed and developed over time, what we can know about the things that have existed on this planet and how they all fit together, those kind of questions fascinate me. Now, there's another important thing that you need to know about me that might not come as a huge surprise. That's about my faith. I'm a Christian. I was brought up in a Christian family, but I was always encouraged from a really early age to explore my faith, to really think about it, to question it. And sort of looking back on it, I've kind of figured out that the way I usually did this was to think, well, what are the questions that I have in life? What are the big questions that we've just been hearing about? What are the big questions that I have? And what kind of answers am I being offered? What answers am I being offered from maybe school, church, family, friends, the media? What kind of things are being offered to me as potential answers to my questions? And which of those seem to make the most sense? Now, I can't claim that as a 4-year-old I was working through all the complicated philosophy that Chris has just been describing, but I've always kind of had this attitude of trying to think through, what are my questions? What answers am I being offered? And which of those seem good enough? Which seem to make the most sense? Now, for me, in terms of my questions about religious faith, big questions about meaning and purpose, I've always found that the answers offered by Christianity seem to make the most sense to me. We can ask more questions about that later if you want to, about particularly why I find Christianity so compelling as an explanation to those questions. But I've always had these two kind of passions, if you like. Seems a bit cliched, but growing up, this faith that was hugely important and fundamental to my life, and this love of science, of exploring the world around me, trying to figure out how it all worked. So it might be unsurprising that quite early on, people started asking me questions like, well, how does that work? How can you be a Christian and a scientist? How, particularly, can you believe what the Bible says is true about God creating the world and study evolution and believe that that's giving us some idea of truth as well? How do those things work together? And eventually, I ended up spending so much time talking about those questions and reading about them and writing about them that I figured it was probably worthwhile trying to do it for a job. And that led me to work for the Faraday Institute, based in Cambridge. I've been there 2.5, 3 years, but involved in this kind of discussion for a lot longer. Always kind of thinking about, concerned with these questions of how science and religion might fit together, with particular interest in looking at creation and evolution and how we can start to think about those questions. Now, my particular joy in this is that this kind of job, this kind of work, this kind of discussion isn't about me turning up and giving you all the answers. It's about me turning up and encouraging your questions. Turning up and saying, well, what questions do you have? What big questions do you have in life? Maybe have you always had? What kind of answers are you being offered? Maybe here's a slightly different way of thinking about it. But what seems to make the most sense to you? And the extra joy in that is that I can point you over there to the bookstall or to lots of our resources which give you input from many, many people far more intelligent and with far more to say than I am, who can help you think about these questions a lot more. So that's kind of what we're doing today. That's what I'm hoping to do in this talk, and what I'm hoping the rest of today and your kind of ongoing discussions from it will enable you to do. Now, before we go much further, I always kind of feel like I can't come into a place, claim to be a scientist, and not do any science. Now, it's difficult to come in here and sort of do some evolutionary biology at you. But what I thought we'd do is just have a little bit of a play with some science in order to start getting our heads into the kind of things, what sort of questions does science look at? What kind of things does science do? And in order to do that, I need some cash. And this is the point at which I start to feel a bit like a con artist or a magician. You can pick which one. But does anybody have any cash on them? Paper money? Anyone at all? Oh, thank you, Chris. You must trust me. Okay, so audience participation time. What can you tell me about this? What can we observe about it? What do you know about it? Anybody tell me anything about this? Just where everyone's very quiet. You don't trust me at all. It belongs to Chris. Yep. I promise this is an easy question time. I know your heads are full of philosophy, but we're into easy question territory here. It's a written contract. Thank you. Very good. There was a hand at the back. Yep.
Legal tender in the United Kingdom.
Legal tender. Excellent. Can we go even a little bit simpler, maybe? What's it made of? It's a piece of paper. Thank you very much. Okay, I told you, easy questions. And what do we know about paper? What kind of things do we know about paper from our observations of the world? It's made from wood. Fantastic. Anything else we know about it? It's not worth it. Maybe I can give you a bit of a clue if I go to my, my little props bag down here. Anything else we know about paper? It burns. Fantastic. Okay. So, do you still trust me?
Yes.
Good. But what is trust, hey? So, practical exercises. So paper burns. Okay, now in science, we take things that we know about the world, or that we think we know about the world, whatever knowledge may or may not be, and we test it a bit. We do some experiments, we test it out, and we try to corroborate things that we know about the world or prove them wrong. So what we could do is say, well, we'll do some science. We think paper usually burns. We think this is made of paper. We think this is going to burn it. So we could just set fire to it and see what happens. Now, we were kind of promised that we weren't expecting a fire here today. Hopefully that's going to remain true, but you know where the fire exits are if you need them. But to my mind, that wouldn't be the most interesting science, okay? We could do that. We could probably set fire to the money. We'd corroborate what we thought we knew about the world. We might commit a minor amount of treason, and Chris probably wouldn't be very happy with me. But I think we can make this a little bit more interesting. And we're going to do that by thinking, can anybody think of anything that doesn't burn? All kinds of things, yeah. I might be able to give you a little bit of a clue. Again, easy questions time. Water, fantastic. So, any ideas what might happen if we take something that we know burns, something that we know doesn't burn, mix them together and set fire to it? Any ideas at all? So this is science, right? So we're going to do an experiment. That's what we're going to do. Still trust me? Feeling good? Okay. Something we know burns, something we know doesn't burn, appropriate safety measures, and a little bit of science. Ooh. Okay. Let's have some observation up here. Chris, you can observe this. Can you tell us anything about this note now? It smells a bit. Is it burnt for a start?
No.
It's not burnt. It's a little bit soggy, but it smells a bit. Any idea what it smells of?
Methylated spirits.
Methylated spirits. Okay, I may have cheated a little bit. This isn't just water. Some of you may have been able to guess that straight away. This is actually a mixture of water and alcohol. Okay, it's a 50-50 mixture. Now, obviously, we think about this if we'd have just put the paper in water. If you ever tried to light a fire with damp paper, it just doesn't work very well. It wouldn't have burnt. If we put the paper in straight alcohol, if you've ever tried to light a fire with paper that's been dumped in alcohol, then it probably would have burnt quite well. And again, we'd have had to observe the fire exits. But actually, putting it in the mixture of water and alcohol gives us a slightly different experience. Because what we get is the alcohol burns off, but the alcohol burns off while the paper is made wet by the water. So the water keeps the paper damp enough that it doesn't burn up with the burning alcohol. So it's a fun little experiment. It makes me look a little bit like a magician. It introduces an element of risk and maybe woke a few people up. But the point of it is to think about the kind of questions that science asks, to think about the kind of things that science does. Generally speaking, science takes things that we think we know about the world, stretches it a bit, looks a bit further. It asks that kind of question. What will happen if we do this? What will happen if we poke nature, if you like? Those are the kind of questions that science is really, really good at asking. But we've just been hearing that actually science, that kind of thinking, doesn't answer all of our questions. That there are lots of other ways of thinking, lots of other ways of looking at the world that are really important and valid, but don't come into that sort of general understanding of the scientific type of questioning. There are lots and lots of other types of questioning and knowledge that it's important to consider. Now, I like to try and sum this up with a bit of a jigsaw here. This is not to say that all of these live in their own little separate boxes and never touch each other, but what it's starting to say is when we think about the way that we usually approach life, we can kind of isolate some different types of questions, some different categories of questioning, sort of scientific questioning of how do things work and where do they come from. We've got that sort of moral and ethical questioning that was referred to earlier, saying, well, what should we do? What's right? What's wrong? Those kind of things that we've just heard a quote from Dawkins that says, well, science doesn't have a metric for that. Science also doesn't have a metric for what's beautiful, aesthetics. You don't do an experiment and sort of come out with your results and say, oh, it's 8.4, that's a shame. If it had been 8.5, it would have been beautiful. It's just not really the way that it works. It's a different type of questioning. We've got our own experience and memories and understanding. We've got religious type of questions. We've got historical questions. Lots of different types of questioning that we use in everyday life. But what we find when we start to think about them is that they don't exist in their own little boxes, separated off from each other. But actually they interact with each other a lot. You find this if you start to do some science, maybe we start to think about atoms and atomic theory, and we go, oh, atoms, they're kind of cool. What happens? Maybe we can break them apart. And so we start to break them apart, and we go, oh, great, we can do that. What does it do? Well, it releases loads of energy. Brilliant. What can we do with that? Loads of things we could do with that. We could try and harness it and figure out what we can do. Well, you know, we could also create weapons of mass destruction that will wipe out half the planet. And then suddenly, you find you're into a different category of questioning. We've slipped into another way of thinking. We have to think about, well, should we do that? Should we push science to the limits of what it can do and achieve and find out? And then somebody comes along and says, well, actually, my religious faith tells me something about the sanctity of life and gives me some kind of idea about whether or not we should create these weapons of mass destruction that will wipe out half the planet. So we start to find that these different types of questioning, although it's really useful and important to consider the differences between them, we have to consider how they interact with each other. And so that's what comes into thinking about these questions of science and religion, that there are lots of different categories, different ways of thinking that interact with each other in all kinds of fascinating and really important ways. A couple of quotes just to sort of back this up. There's one here from Sir Peter Medawar, who was a very famous scientist who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine a few years ago. He was an atheist, and he said this: "The existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions, such as how did everything begin, what are we all here for, and what is the point of living? The beginning of scientific wisdom, I would argue, is an informed and respectful recognition of its limits." Another similar quote here from Dr. Jennifer Wiseman. She's the project manager of the Hubble telescope at NASA, takes all those incredible pictures out into space. She's a Christian, and she says this: "Science is limited to characterizing the regular workings of the natural world, and it does so very well. But I believe there are profound truths that science is just not equipped to address, such as questions of purpose, God, meaning, and how we should live our lives." So both of these people from totally different faith backgrounds, if you like, coming out with this idea and summing up saying science is really, really good at what it does. It's really good at asking and answering a particular type of question. But there are so many other types of thinking, so many other types of questioning that science is not very good at. And actually, in order to do science well as in order to think well about life and try and figure out what's really going on, what the big picture is, it's very, very important to recognize what those limits are. The limits that science has, the things it's really good at, and the things it doesn't do. So this is an example that many of you will have heard if you've been around in this discussion at all. But it's quite a useful one, I find, to start thinking about some of these different types of questions and actually how they can interact. So I've said that some of these different categories of questions will often interact with each other. Scientific and religious we're often thinking about at the moment. But how might they interact? And this example goes some way towards that. If I asked you this question, if you came in and there was a kettle boiling away in the middle of the room, and I turned to you and I said, "Why is the kettle boiling?" You could, depending on your area of specialism, come in and tell me all kinds of interesting things about why the kettle's boiling, something to do with the energy input, perhaps there's a flame underneath it, you've got heat, you've got conduction of the heat energy through the metal, you've got the water, the molecules becoming excited, bonds breaking, all of this, it's heating up to about 100 degrees C, and we get change of state from a liquid to a gas. We could go on and on and on and on. Many of you will know far more about it than I do. We could give the answer from science, straight out of our big book of science, why the kettle is boiling. But you might equally come in and say, "Oh, that kettle's boiling because I want a cup of tea." Now here we have a really, really good example of two very different types of answer to the same question. And what is very unlikely here is that you would turn around and say, "Hang on, no, I don't believe you about all that energy input and the transfer of energy and the state change. The only reason I will accept for the kettle boiling is that somebody wants a cup of tea." And you're also very unlikely to turn around and say, "No, I don't believe you that you want a cup of tea. The only reason I will accept for the kettle boiling is the input of energy and the state change." In this example, we very, very happily take these two things together and not only see that they sort of rub alongside each other okay, but that we get a bigger and a better picture of what's really going on in this whole picture of the kettle boiling when we take the two together. Now, the reason that that works is to hark back to an idea that Chris mentioned briefly. Often science and religion are kind of given these labels, how questions and why questions. And I agree that's pretty simplistic, but it gives us a good start. We can think about science as looking at how type questions. But obviously, as we've heard, it's not that simple. A kind of step along the way that I find quite useful is to think science tends to look at mechanism. It looks at sort of how stuff works, the nuts and bolts, the bits and pieces, the mechanism of what's going on in the world around us. That tends to be what we use science for. Whereas this thing of me wanting a cup of tea over here, it's not looking at mechanism. What it's looking at is meaning. Meaning and purpose. That's the kind of slightly deeper way of looking at the why-type question. It's almost bringing a context of meaning and purpose to this situation, within which our understanding of mechanism can fit and expand our knowledge, our thinking about the situation. So what we see here, well, we have that mechanism and the meaning kind of working together. We get a bigger and a better picture of what's going on in this situation. Now, that's the kind of relationship that I and a lot of others would say exists with questions about life, the universe, and everything. Our big questions about life can be looked at in terms of mechanism from the science. But as we've just heard, there are lots of other elements of it. Questions particularly of meaning and purpose, what it's all about, what we're doing here, what the point of it all is. And that's where religious faiths come into it. Those are the kind of questions that religious faiths claim to look at, claim to answer. So just like with the kettle boiling, I think this is quite a useful example to look at and think, well, perhaps if we take the science for the mechanism and we take this kind of context of meaning and purpose offered to us by an understanding of religious faith, perhaps that could give us a bigger and a better understanding of what's really going on with these kind of questions, more so than we'd have if we just had one or the other. So given that kind of context, here's a couple of quotes just to sum this up. This is from Dr. Francis Collins. I'm sure many of you will have heard of him. He was the director of the Human Genome Project. He's now the director of the National Institutes of Health in America. He advises the US government on what kind of science they should do. It's pretty important as science jobs go. He's a Christian. And he says, if you want to get answers about how nature works, science is the way to get there. Religious faith, in its proper perspective, is asking a different set of questions. Those aren't scientific questions, and science doesn't have much to say about them. And that's why I don't think there needs to be a conflict here. A similar quote here from Stephen Jay Gould, who's a very famous evolutionary biologist in America. He died a few years ago. He was an atheist. And he said this: either half of my colleagues are enormously stupid, or else the science of Darwinism is fully compatible with conventional religious beliefs, and equally compatible with atheism. So what he's saying there, with no particular religious agenda himself, is actually, even in this area that is often brought up as being very contentious in the science-religion discussion, actually looking at the evolutionary biology, looking at the science itself. You can do that whether you're a Christian or an atheist, whatever your faith background. And he goes on to explain that, in his view, this is because the science in and of itself is asking scientific questions. And religious questions aren't necessarily in the same playing field as that. Now, for him, he goes on, he has a much more separatist idea of the two. He has this phrase, non-overlapping magisteria, and he would say that scientific and religious questions are totally separate from each other. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think they come into contact more than that. And it's more in that sense, as I say, of your worldview, if you like, religious-type questions, creating the kind of context of meaning and purpose within which your scientific understanding fits. But it's still that idea that the two are asking a different type of question. And actually, I think that gives us a really, really good way of starting to explore some of the interactions between scientific and religious questions. For example, when we start to think about these questions of evolution and the Bible, it's really a question of origins. What we're really talking about here, for the most part, is, well, where do we come from? Maybe not just us as humanity, but we, the population of this planet, living things. Where do we come from? What's it all about? How have we got here? What's the point of it all? These things all kind of tie in together. It's this question of origins. So what we're going to look at, as briefly as we can manage today, is what does science have to say about origins? And then we'll look a little bit later at what does religion have to say about origins? And then we'll have a little bit of a look at how those things might come together. Now, as you can imagine, it's a fairly big topic. We're not going to be able to go into the whole thing in massive detail, but I'm going to hopefully give you a little bit of an overview. Now, to start with looking at what science has to say about origins, I've got a video clip that I'm hoping will work. It might be a little bit complicated, so bear with me. I'll try and explain it afterwards, but let's see if this will go. Okay, now working a little bit slowly, but I'm sure some of you recognize that. For those of you that didn't, there's a very popular US TV series called The Big Bang Theory, which follows the lives of a number of scientists and those that end up interacting with them. Definitely worth a watch. I watched it for a long time before I went to university, thinking, surely people aren't really like that. And then went and studied science at Cambridge University. My opinions may have changed. But the reason that I use that is that actually that little theme tune, if you manage to pick up some of the words in it, it gives a pretty good description, albeit very brief, of what science tells us a little bit about origins at the moment. We have this idea of the Big Bang Theory, which I'm not really going to go into, sort of the idea that stuff started at some point. Stuff being space-time and starting being very difficult to figure out quite what people mean by it. That's as far as we're going to go with the physics in it, because I'm not a physicist. But we're taking into this idea that there is some stuff around and it's beginning to develop. That's our kind of starting point here. As we go on thinking about this, the bit that I'm really going to start talking about is more my area of expertise in the Big Bang. Looking at evolution, looking particularly at fossils. What fossils can tell us about the world around us? Now, I find these particularly interesting. I've been fascinated by fossils for a very long time, and I'm aware that they're not everybody's cup of tea, that not everybody's heart skips a beat when they see a particularly exciting rock. But I'm hoping to at least give you a little bit of interest. I've brought a few with me to show off at this point. Some of these you'll have seen before. If you can see this, this is an ammonoid, or an ammonite. It's an ancient relative of the octopus and the squid, a cephalopod. It used to live in the sea, sort of squidding about with tentacles coming out of its shell. Lots and lots of these around. If you get a chance to pick them up, all kinds of interesting stuff we can find out about them. I'm not going to go on about them forever, but just something that you'll have recognized to start off with. We can find things that might be a little bit more recognizable today. Those of you that can see this is a tiny fish. And this fossil is quite exciting because generally when things fossilize, as we'll touch on a bit in a moment, we just get the hard parts. We get bones and teeth. But as you might be able to make out from this one, we find out something a little bit more from this, because as well as the bones and teeth fossilizing, we've got some of the skin and the scales and bits and pieces. touching on the idea that actually sometimes we get a bit more of a clue about the animal represented by the fossil than just the bones and teeth. And the more that we have in the fossil, the more we can discover about the kind of animal that it came from. I'm going to explore these a bit more in a minute, but I just want to show off some stuff to try and prove that fossils can be a little bit interesting before we go much further. This is the tooth of a T-Rex. Dinosaurs, see, dinosaurs are always a winner. This is the tooth of a T-Rex. It's quite a small tooth for a T-Rex, but you still wouldn't really want one of those coming at you, especially not ahead of them. Pretty vicious things. This one is a claw from a dinosaur called a baryonyx. If you've seen films such as Jurassic Park or Jurassic World, you'll have seen velociraptors portrayed, perhaps not entirely as we think they were, but I won't go on about that. Definitely not worth the rant. But again, quite impressive. It gives us a clue about something that used to be around a long time ago that I think in this case, thankfully, isn't around anymore. I've got a few more bits and pieces that I might take a break to show off to you here or there throughout the rest of this, but hopefully that and the pictures start to give you a bit of an idea that actually fossils are a bit more than a rock. Now, I'm, as a geologist, quite interested in the rocks themselves as well, but fossils give us a little bit more of a picture of something about the past. And I like to think about it like this. To me, fossils are like a time machine. It's a bit abstract, bear with me, let's go with me on this. Okay, if we had a time machine, and we got into it and we travelled back, say, 100 years, got out and looked around, all of the animals and plants that we saw around us would be pretty much the same as they are today. We'd have dogs, pigs, cows, sheep, horses, chickens, that kind of thing. They'd look pretty similar. Maybe a few changes here and there, but not a huge amount. If we went back 1,000 years, similar kind of picture. Again, dogs would be a bit different because we've done a lot of selective breeding on them and some other farm animals and stuff. But the same kind of things. Animals and plants, pretty much the same as today. But if we went back in time, say, 100,000 years, or 1,000,000 years, or 100 million years, or even further, then actually the stuff that we saw around us, the animals and plants that we saw around us as we got out to explore, would be totally different from how we know them today. We'd have those giant dinosaurs rampaging around the place, or dragonflies the size of small aircraft sort of flying around forests of giant moss. We'd have great woolly mammoths and rhinos and things that we don't even recognize today. The seas and the land full of totally unrecognizable things. And the only reason that we can know anything, the only way we can know anything about those creatures, about what they looked like, about what this planet has been teeming with throughout its history, essentially the only way we can know about that is through the fossils. It's through the fossil record. Through this record of things that have been alive on this planet, have died and have managed to die in a useful enough place that we get some kind of record of them later on. Now, to me, that's quite fascinating, because this kind of process of very, very quickly fossilization, something dies, we get some hard parts left over. If it makes it into water, particularly likely to get covered up by mud and sand and things, which over time gets compressed into rock. Again, over more time, water trickling through that rock dissolves away the original material. We're left with a mold in the shape of the original bone or tooth or whatever it might be. That can get filled in by minerals carried in the water, growing out just like crystals, if you've ever done that sort of grow your own crystals thing. Exactly the same thing, filling in this space in the rock. So we end up with a rock replica of the initial thing. That's the fossil. And eventually some of them might make their way up onto the surface. Through movements of the Earth's crust, through erosion, through really keen geologists with hammers, some of these things that used to be alive make it through this really quite difficult and unlikely process to end up as part of our fossil record that we see today. Through that process, we can end up getting a picture of some of the things that have been alive on this planet throughout its history. From about 550 million years ago, where we start to see things that are sort of multicellular animals, plants, things that look a little bit like living things that we would see today. But as you see through this timeline, going back from 550 million years at the bottom, all the way up to today at the top, they start to give us a bit of a picture that some of those things you might recognize, some of them you might have no idea about. And there's a huge amount more besides this that we'd have no idea about at all if it weren't for the fossil record. Now, to explore this a little bit further, we're going to very quickly play a bit of a game. This is just checking my timing. Mostly to keep your interest, partly just because I think it's fun, and because everybody loves a dinosaur. So, this game, bit of a quiz called Am I a Dinosaur? All I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures, I'm going to put them up on the board, and I'm going to ask you whether you think it's a dinosaur or not. Okay, very easy. It's easy questions time again. We'll go school style, so I'll get you to put your hands up if that's okay. So the first one, Tyrannosaurus rex. Could you put your hand up for me if you think this is a dinosaur? Hands up for yes. Hands up for no. Excellent, well done everybody, gold stars. T-Rex is a dinosaur, lived about 68 to 66 million years ago. A woolly mammoth, next one on the cards. Hands up if you think woolly mammoth might be a dinosaur. Hands up for yes. Hands up for no. Excellent, good job, nice easy intro. Woolly mammoths, not dinosaurs, obviously they're mammals. They were around sort of 200,000 to 4,000 years ago. As best we can understand, they were mostly driven to extinction at the end of their life, something to do with humans, so, you know, let's think about conservation, just points to the talks later on. And try not to hunt everything around us to extinction. Probably not the best way of looking after the planet. Now, crocodiles. Crocodiles have been around about 200 million years. Anybody think they might be dinosaurs? Hands up for yes. Hands up for no. Ooh, we're more split on this one. This is always where it gets fun. Okay, so crocodiles are not dinosaurs. They've been around a very long time. They lived at the same time as many of the dinosaurs, but they're sort of cousins to the dinosaurs. So one of the ways that we think about evolutionary biology, one of the things that we try to do, is figure out the relationships between things. Work out who's who in the family. And if we were to draw out a family tree of the dinosaurs, the crocodiles would be fairly close in, but they're not actually dinosaurs themselves. They're cousins to the dinosaurs, rather than being within their direct family. You know, they might visit at Christmas, but they're not there all the time. It's that kind of understanding. Now, velociraptors, I've mentioned already. I'm still going to avoid talking about how much not like the portrayal of Jurassic Park we think they were. This is much more what we think they looked like, and they're probably about this high. But who thinks they're dinosaurs? Hands up for yes. And hands up for no. Oh, one or two brave now. These ones are dinosaurs, I'm afraid. Jurassic Park got a lot wrong about them, but it did at least get the fact that they're dinosaurs right. They were around about 75 to 71 million years ago. Now, birds, mostly because of the cute penguin, birds have been around about 150 million years. Hands up if you think they might be dinosaurs. One or two? Hands up for no. I love this moment. Okay, so according to our best understandings from science, birds are technically dinosaurs. Now this works, again, thinking about that family tree idea, as we track back the bird family tree, and we can do this not just from the fossil record, but from molecular data as well, from the DNA. As we trace it all back, we find the common ancestor of all the birds directly within the dinosaur family tree, within a group of dinosaurs called the theropods, which included things like T-Rex, Velociraptor, all the kind of big, scary, meat-eating dinosaurs. That's where the birds come from. So it might give you a slightly different view of your pet budgie or the chicken you're going to eat in your sandwich for lunch, you know, that kind of idea. So what about pterosaurs? If you've heard of pterodactyls, they're a type of pterosaur, also featured heavily in the recent Jurassic World film, although quite how they were supposed to carry people in the sky, let's not even go there. But pterosaurs were around for a while. Who thinks they might be dinosaurs? Hands up for yes. Hands up for no. This is another of my favorite moments. Pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. Again, around at the same time as lots of the dinosaurs, but cousins to the dinosaurs rather than within their family tree. So we're now left in a place by our exploring science in this area where birds are dinosaurs and pterodactyls aren't. Surprises. Science is full of surprises. Now this last one I've got a further visual aid for. This is an animal called an ichthyosaur. This is a fossil of one. Pretty fearsome looking beasts. They lived in the water. Who thinks they might be dinosaurs? Hands up for yes. and hands up for no. Oh, you're getting wise to me. Ichthyosaurs are also not dinosaurs. Again, around 250 to 90 million years ago, so a pretty good innings, but not dinosaurs, cousins to the dinosaurs. And actually one of the interesting things that we find from looking at all the evidence from fossils and genetics is that all of the things that we know about that we think are dinosaurs that live within that dinosaur family were walking around on land. They weren't swimming and they weren't flying. So anything else from that time that was swimming or flying were not a dinosaur. And in fact, the only dinosaurs that we know about that flew were the lineage that led to the birds. So this is that dinosaur family tree that I've been talking about. It is, as we can see, if you're familiar with the family tree idea, you might have those things that are closer together, more closely related. The further apart on the tree, you're more distantly related. You may have in your family tree a point where you say, well, at this point, some people got married, and from that stage on, everybody was a Jones. But in this case, rather than people getting married and becoming a Jones, this is the point at which enough characters come together that we say, well, from that point on, they're dinosaurs. So everything within that group is a dinosaur, and everything outside of it, you can see the crocodiles and the pterosaurs, not a dinosaur. So fossils can help us to work out the history of life on Earth and how it's changed over time. I'm going to skip through this very quickly because we're getting slightly over time. The dinosaurs are clearly too exciting for me. This gives us a bit of an idea of the timeline of Earth, if we were to stretch it out across the span of our arms. Just to further reinforce this idea that actually, for the vast swathe of the history of life on Earth, the history of Earth being about 4.5 billion years, 4.6 billion years, origins of life, we're now thinking somewhere between 3.5 to 4 billion years. Actually, in this picture, even animals don't come along until pretty late on. Dinosaurs and large mammals, you can see, and we actually, hominin and human history is a pretty small deal as far as the history of life on Earth is concerned. On this scale, we could wipe out all of human history with one swipe of a nail file. It's a pretty sobering thought. This is this idea of evolution by natural selection, the driving force behind all of this, if you like, the way in which we understand the development of life on Earth. For those of you that don't know anything about this, this gives you a very short introduction to it. For those that do, you'll be very familiar with the idea that basically what evolution says is, well, there are small changes that happen each time there's a new generation. And they respond better or worse to the environment than other small changes. And over time, those small changes add up to big changes. And some of those big changes become so different from another group that they become what we call different species. Now, there are different definitions that work in a part of that, but essentially, it's a way of us trying to figure out some distinction in the natural world. Small changes adding up to big changes, leading to a huge diversity of life on Earth. This is a slightly bigger family tree. This is looking at all of life on Earth. And as you can see, that blue group, they're all bacteria. The red group in the middle, they're pretty much bacteria too. The brown group on the right is everything that isn't pretty much a bacterium. And I don't know if you can tell at the top, those three tiny branches there, all of animals, fungi, and plants. So pretty much everything that we might look at and say, well, that's life on Earth, fits into those three tiny branches up there. Now we're going to span this out a bit. We're going to show a few more things on this family tree, and I've twisted it around into a circle just so you can see a little bit more of it on the screen, because otherwise it would have to be enormous. It's still quite simplistic, but let's just see if you can spot us on it. So this is, we've shrunk down all the bacteria here. Those two major groups are all down here. So this is just the others, animals, plants, and fungi, and a few other bits and pieces. Can anybody see humans on there in this scale? Let me zoom in a little bit. There you go. You're here. So this is the picture that we get from science. This is what science tells us about our origins. A huge amount. It tells us about an amazing diversity of life. And our most common ancestors, the orangutans, the bonobos, the gorillas, the chimps, humans. This little tiny, tiny group of primates, of great apes, living in this very tiny amount of Earth's history, with one group thinking they're quite important. There's a lot of similarities between us and chimpanzees. I'm not going to go into all this detail now. But our common ancestors with chimpanzees, we think were about 6 or 7 million years ago. They're our closest living relatives. There's a huge amount of similarity in our bone structures, the way that we actually look at us, our genetics. There's a huge amount of evidence for our common ancestry. And even the way that we think, the way that we work, the way that we solve problems. Now, we have to be very careful thinking about intelligence in animals and how that's portrayed and how we think about it. But if you spend any time with chimpanzees, if you're lucky enough, or watching some of the documentaries or reading some of the studies about them, comparative studies between chimpanzees and toddlers, the way that they learn, the way that they appear to figure out the world around them, there's a huge amount of similarity, and it's absolutely fascinating. And those are the kind of things that science can give us a bit of a picture into. I'm not even going to begin to go through this. This idea, you'll have seen this picture before. This is just me dispelling a common myth here. This is not saying that we are evolved from chimpanzees. This is saying that we and chimpanzees have a common ancestor, and each of these pictures used in this description is of a hominin ancestor. This idea over here, this picture is not of a chimpanzee. This is one of our common ancestors with chimpanzees several million years ago. So just to dispel the myth that we are evolved, or that anybody says that we are evolved from chimpanzees or from the apes around today, we have a common ancestor with them. They're our cousins, living cousins. This is the picture that science gives us. That we have this common ancestry, that we're a tiny part of this huge picture of life on Earth over a huge length of time. Science tells us an enormous amount about our origins and where we come from and what we're doing here. But does it tell us everything? Does it really get to answering this question of where we come from? On the one hand, it's a fascinating and very full picture. On the other hand, it's quite a bleak picture, because we're really not that important, that big of a deal. And yet each of us wakes up with a head full of thoughts that kind of ask all these questions like, well, what's the point of it all? And actually that picture from science doesn't really questions. What it says is, oh, here's your ancestors. Like, and how it got there. Isn't that interesting? And you say, still doesn't give us any idea about meaning or purpose. Now, most religious teachings include some ideas about how and why the earth and humans came to exist. The Bible, those first chapters in Genesis, where we're given this story that God creating the world in 6 days and humans on day 6. We have of what religion tells us about origins. Often that's where it stops. Well, science gives us all this information about evolution. God, man in the sky with a beard, making everything in 6 24-hour periods. Surely those things are in conflict. Now, this comes with a proviso that Christians, lots of people have very different ideas about this, about how we connection between science and religious faith, science and Christianity, and that's good. It's fine. And the important thing to recognize from a Christianity point of view is that what the Bible says about creation, what we central tenet of Christianity. I know a lot of Christians to me on this, and we all get on with each other. We can all talk to each other, and it's the central tenet of Christianity is what we think about Jesus, rather than what we think about the. Explore just very quickly some of what this type of religious teaching might tell us about origins. And I think that's a shame, because actually the Bible talks about God's creation in many, many different ways, at many different examples, different places where the Bible talks about creation or God as creator. And it does that in a whole number of different styles, different emphases. And we could look at any one of these and start to pick out different aspects of it. And when we do that, because if we start to look at them all and try and expect them to be describing a scientific account, or an account that relates to an absolute, then we find some contradiction pretty quickly, actually. Genesis, the story of God creating animals, and then man, and then woman. We have a slightly different story about creation, where and then animals, and then woman. So already, just 2 chapters into the Bible, contradiction. Now we could say at this point, oh, well, there's clearly contradiction, we shouldn't believe any of it, But I don't think that's really a very wise way to look at it. Because the Bible, it's a collection of writings from a very, very long period of history. By different people, for different purposes. Or history or anything, then you'll have some idea that when we find a book or some kind of idea to start thinking about who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it, what. And it's when we start to do that, when we start to think about what kind of source the Bible is, a slightly different picture, a slightly different way of thinking about what. And what I find when I look at it is this, that actually in each of those passages, in each about God as creator, the focus is on purpose and meaning. It comes back to these ideas. This in a couple of examples. This from Revelation 4, where it says, "Worthy are you, our Lord and our God, for you created all things, and because of your will they existed and were." What the passage is doing is it's saying, look, God, you created everything, and therefore you're worthy of our. As we believe that God is the creator, we need to have a pretty big view of God, one that deserves quite a lot of attention. It says, Lord, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, what are human beings that you should care for them? Yet you crown them. God, when I think about the fact that you created everything, when I look at this incredible nature, this creation that surrounds me, what that does is it puts in my mind questions about who I am and where I come from, and actually the fact that to have a relationship with God. What these passages do is they take us to a place of saying, well, look, if God is the creator, from us. If God is the creator, what does that say about? What does it say about the purpose? And to my mind, how the Bible is more about those questions of meaning and purpose than it is looking like a description of quite how it happened. So what happens then when these religious and scientific ideas meet? To my mind, it fits quite nicely into this idea that I've talked about earlier, that the science describes kind of a mechanism of how things have come to be the way that they are. But what the religious faith texts seem to be most kind of concerned with is bringing a context of meaning and purpose into which we can decide what we think about how it happened. It seems like the Bible is particularly very concerned with telling us there's meaning, there's purpose. There's a point to all of this, within which we can then start to ask our questions about the mechanism. And to me, I find that actually the science gives us a very compelling and interesting understanding of that mechanism. Now, if you'll bear with me for just a couple more minutes, I'm sorry, I know I'm over, just because I know this will come up in questions and it will be in some of your minds. So I'm going to touch on this very quickly, and hopefully we'll get some chance to think about it questions later. Because even with that established, we still have these questions over that Genesis account. What do those 6 days mean? What does that story mean? What does it look like when we start to think about it like this? And this, as I say, is only one view. This is my view. There are lots and lots of other ways of looking at this. But as I look at that text in Genesis 1 to 3, I would see it as telling the truth, but not giving a scientific description. I'm going to unpack that a little more, but what I mean by that is actually there are lots of things that we consider true, but not scientific. For example, if I came in here and said to you, my love is a red, red rose, you'd all get the idea that I was in love with somebody, that maybe I thought they were quite nice, but you probably wouldn't actually think I was in love with a flower. In that sense, you see there's truth in it, whether or not you choose to believe it, but you see that there's a claim to truth, but it's not trying to give a scientific account. It's not trying to give a historic account. It's not trying to give, if you like, a literal account. It's getting across truth without it being scientific. And to my mind, that's the kind of thing going on in this passage. And it comes from looking at the context of it. This isn't a result of looking at the science and going, oh goodness, how do I fit this story in the Bible around the science now? It comes from doing what I said earlier, looking at the context of it, thinking about who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it. And very, very quickly, this was written, our best guess was by Moses, a very long time ago, in a pre-scientific culture, a long time before people had any ideas of the kind of science that we know today. And if you think about it, if we tried to write down all the science that we know today, or we think we know today, about how the universe has come to be the way it is, it would be very long and complicated. It probably wouldn't make sense to anybody in its entirety, and it would be out of date very quickly. And what it wouldn't do is do a very good job of getting across the kind of central points that the creation story in Genesis does, just to say God is the ultimate creator. He made everything, he made humanity, and he wants a relationship with us. So this story is doing something quite different. And we have no reason to expect, actually, that people at that time would have had an understanding of the science that we know today. It's written in a very poetic style that matches a lot of the poetry that we see from the time. If we look at this, one of the examples is there's rhyming in it. We have tohu vabohu, the words used for formless and empty. We have this kind of pattern of 3 days of forming spaces and 3 days of filling those spaces. The way that it's written is very rhythmic and poetic. There's a huge amount more to it that we see in terms of literary style, rather than necessarily trying to be a scientific account. This is a fascinating point that I'm not really going to go into, but there were lots of other creation stories in other civilizations at the time, talking about gods having to come down and subdue great monsters in order to take control of the earth, or creating mankind to be their slaves. And actually, the biblical account we're given here seems to talk directly against those other stories, to say, well, actually, there's something very different about this understanding of God. It's making a point that there's a radically different idea of God being expressed here than anything else in the surrounding cultures. And actually, when we view it this way, the Genesis account and this view of it presents the other biblical creation accounts as adding to, rather than contradicting, our understanding of God as creator. It gives us a fuller picture. It means that we have to take a step back and say, well, if this is the picture we're being given of the meaning and purpose described by God being our creator, then that gives us a huge picture of God. And it gives us a slightly different way of looking at science, as a way of exploring the mechanism by which God may have chosen to do his creation. There's a quote I'm just going to leave you with here from Dennis Alexander, who set up the Faraday Institute. He's a fantastic scientist, theologian, and thinker in his own right. And he says, science is in no way subverting the idea of creation that we have in Genesis 1 to 3. Rather, it's answering a different kind of question. How did God do it? What are the processes that God used to bring all of those things into being? I'll finish there. Thank you very much for bearing with me as we went a bit over time. Thank you a lot.